The next speaker has been known, I'm sure, to all of you for many years. He's been a business associate, in fact, a mentor, and a close friend of mine for 30 years. He is also one who walks the walk in the context of my speech last year. It's one thing to deliver a message. It's another thing to be the message. Doug Casey has used the fact that he has been a successful human being and a successful speculator for 30 years to use his status of being a success in life to convey the message of liberty. Usually people aren't interested in abstracts because they don't know the benefit to them of abstract knowledge. But if the promise in front of them is, I will teach you how to become richer and tell you about a stock that's going to go from 10 cents to $1, and then presto, change-o, we talk about anarchy, liberty, and freedom, the audience, if not involved, is in fact present. Doug Casey has been tireless for 30 years, explaining correctly how success in life, success in investing, and success philosophically are all completely intertwined. Doug Casey also has an absolutely amazing ability to take complex topics and either in speaking or in writing make them simple and understandable. I've wondered for years how he has done this. I thought for a while that he must be a uniquely empathetic human being. Then of course I got to know him and discovered that that wasn't true. What I've decided really in my declining years is that he is so smart and so knowledgeable and so persistent with regards to, and also by the way, so outrageous, so fearless, that he succeeds just by force of intellect and force of will. But you didn't come here to hear me, or if you did, you already did. So ladies and gentlemen, Doug Casey.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you. And thank you all for being here. What I want to talk about today, and I'll get right into it because I've got a lot of things to say. I want to talk about conflated, confused, and misused words. And the reason I want to do that is because over the years I've become kind of a stickler on not just saying what you mean and meaning what you say, but making sure that the words that you use to say something are accurate. Because if you don't define words accurately, then maybe you don't actually know what you're talking about. And certainly the other person that's listening to you also won't know. Maybe you're using different words to describe the same thing, or the same words to describe different things. And what we have is a failure to communicate. And so let me go through a bunch of words, or pairs of words, that I think a lot of people don't actually know what they mean. And since I just came from a financial conference, let me start with some financial ones, which are kind of interesting. They just kind of annoy me. That also kind of relate to the bigger society that we're in. Ton. They say, okay, you've got a ton of ore. Okay, that's fine. Miners use ore by the ton. But which ton is it? A T-O-N or a T-O-N-N? I'm sure everybody here knows the difference, right? Well, maybe not. That doesn't bother me so much, that people interchange T-O-N and T-O-N-N-E, because one, of course, is a short English ton, and the other is a long metric ton, 2,000 pounds as opposed to 2,204 pounds or something like that. But here's what bothers me. Most of you guys are interested in gold, I presume, or you should be, right now anyway. And all the time now, they're describing gold in tons. The IMF sold 3 tons of gold. The US owns 8,000 tons of gold. And since this meme started describing gold in tons, it's spread. Now, it's incredibly stupid and counterproductive from a liberty point of view if you believe that gold has anything to do with liberty. Why? Because nobody uses gold by the ton. Nobody but maybe governments buy or sell it by the ton, so it becomes kind of an abstract, a meaningless concept, tons of gold. Nobody owns a ton of gold. Oh, incidentally, how much is a ton of gold? Let me get this right. It's 32,150 ounces, okay? But then they say T-O-N as opposed to T-O-N-N-E, and you don't even know how much it is. Anyway, I refuse to talk about gold in tons. It's priced in ounces, dollars per ounce. So why do they talk about it in tons when it's bought and sold and used and priced in ounces? I think the reason that this thing started, I think it was started by the bad guys, is to make gold even more of an abstract that's meaningless than it is now. So, just a point. Look out, be sure when you're talking to somebody who talks about gold in tons, there's something wrong there. Another thing, financial thing. They talk about the bond market. And of course, as we speak right now, we're in the middle of the biggest financial bubble in all of history, and it happens to be a bond bubble. But wait a minute. Remember they used to say years ago, bonds and debentures? They used to say that. What's the difference between a bond and a debenture? Well, a bond was something that was secured by an actual asset. That was kind of security for the bond. And a debenture was just, well, what a bond is today. In other words, there's no backing except the general credit of the company or whatever it was. Well, interestingly, everything is a bond today. And the word debenture has kind of gone down the Orwellian memory hole. And nobody's ever heard of a debenture anymore. But they should, because there's a distinction between a bond and a debenture. And I wonder why. It's very interesting. Because bonds really aren't bonds anymore because they're not bonding a specific thing. They're all debentures in today's world. And this is also a sign of an economy that's, well, same problem as with ounces and tons of gold. Another one, time deposits and demand deposits. Now, those of you here in this room that don't have gray hair probably may not have even heard those terms, time deposit and demand deposit. In fact, people think a time deposit was basically a savings account, and a demand deposit was basically a checking account. And everybody said, yeah, I got a savings account and a checking account. But there's really no difference between them now. I mean, they transfer money from one to the other. It used to be, when banking was, in the 19th century, classical banking, demand deposits and time deposits, checking accounts and savings accounts were as different as night and day. Separate businesses. I mean, they're as different as lions and antelopes. So let me explain them, because there's no difference between these things today. A time deposit was one where you gave a bank $1 for a specific period of time. That's why it's called a time deposit. And then it became a savings account, and now it's nothing. Why? Because the bank, if it's going to make a loan, which is how it makes money, it would maybe give you 3% and lend it out to a businessman for 6%. Borrows $1 for a year, it can lend it out for a year and capture that 3% difference to cover its profit, its expenses, and set up a loss reserve. This is not done anymore. There's no banks lend out like 30-year mortgages with money that can come and go in a minute. This is why all the banks in the world are at least illiquid, and I think almost all of them are insolvent. So that's time deposits or savings accounts. And then you have demand deposits or checking accounts. Totally different. Why? Because instead of paying you for the money, you have to pay the bank for storing the money securely and giving you the right to transfer it by writing a check. Why should a bank do that for free? Store it securely and let you write a check. They've got to charge for that. Distinction's totally lost on all this stuff today. Another reason why the banks are all very much in trouble today. Anyway, these are words that should be in use but aren't in use today. Investment and savings. People don't know the difference between that either. That's a very important difference. When people don't understand these basic, everything you hear on television is like a 60-second thing where they're throwing these words around that are undefined, and the talking head doesn't know what he's talking about, certainly. Investment. Investment is putting aside capital in order to create more capital. That is what an investment is, okay? It's different from savings. Savings is the excess of production over consumption, okay? That becomes savings, and then you can use that savings as investment, or you can use it for other things. But nobody makes this distinction anymore. And why is everybody hates savings? They say consumption is good. We live in a consumer society. Well, wait a minute. Isn't it better to live in a producer society? How do you get things to consume if you don't produce them first? And how do you get capital to make savings unless you produce more than you consume? And people don't even look at these basic, actually simple things. And people say, what did Cheney say a few years ago? Debt doesn't matter, okay? Well, it does, because when you have savings, it means you're like a squirrel. I mean, we're all wired in the back of our brains like squirrels. A squirrel knows, I gotta save some nuts for the winter, or I'm gonna starve to death. That's why you see squirrels running around in the fall saving nuts, okay? Well, we're like that too. I mean, even people on welfare kind of understand this basic thing. Savings is good, because it means you've got production for the future that's put aside. What about debt? If you have debt, it means you've been living above your means, okay? And if I borrow $1 million today, I can live high off the hog for the next year. But if I'm ever going to pay it back, I'm not only going to have to radically reduce my standard of living, but it's going to be worse than that, because I'm going to have to pay interest on the debt besides. So yeah, debt does matter. Anyway, speculation and gambling. People say, that's a crazy speculation. It's just gambling. Well, not if you think about it. What's a speculation? Well, a couple of ways to define it, but the way I like to define speculation is it's an allocation of capital in a way that you take advantage of politically caused distortions in the marketplace. The classic speculation of our time was gold in 1971, $35 an ounce. It had been suppressed in price by the government for 40 years, and you knew it was going to explode. So that's the kind of thing a speculator looks for. It's not what a gambler does. I mean, a gambler is looking at a roll of the dice or a turn of the roulette wheel. So don't conflate those two things. And a lot of people think they're investing, and they don't know anything about speculating, and they're actually gambling. So, I mean, I've made all these mistakes. Another financial problem is where and when. I'd like to find out exactly when. We all know what a shareholder is, okay? He's somebody that owns part of an enterprise. What in hell is a stakeholder? You don't hear about shareholders anymore. They're just a nuisance. You hear about stakeholders, people that have nothing in the game, that are basically parasites, but people treat them like they're important. And this wasn't a word that was even used until about the same. All this stuff has been happening within the last 50 years, incidentally. That's how I know about it. Because when I was a kid, even when I was a kid, I knew about these distinctions. But we didn't have stakeholders back then. And now people take this concept seriously. It shouldn't be taken seriously. It's laughable. There is no such thing as a stakeholder. If you want to be a stakeholder, buy a share in the company, and then you can talk. Inflation and deflation. Okay, this is also very confused in people's minds. They say it's confused in a different way. Inflation is where it's an increase in the money supply, which has various effects. And deflation means a decrease in the money supply. But actually what now is inflation is something that has nothing to do with the money supply. It's what happens to prices in the money supply. In other words, inflation is something that happens to the money supply. But today, people think of inflation as something that happens to prices of goods. So this confuses people's thoughts about where inflation comes from. If you understand you only have inflation because of an increase in the money supply, okay. But if you think inflation is the price of bread or gasoline going up, it's not the government's fault. It's those damned oil producers' fault, or it's those damn bakers' fault. So you wind up blaming the people that are fighting inflation, not the people that are causing inflation. So this is, once again, this is sloppy, muddled thinking, and it plays into the advantage of the bad guys. There's so many of these things. Look, money. What is money? Money is a medium of exchange and a store of value. Historically, salt, cows, lots of things have been used for money, cigarettes. But historically, the best money always turns out, for many reasons, which I won't even go into, to be gold, or maybe sometimes silver, or even sometimes copper. But today, people conflate that. It used to be that you'd have a banknote. And how would you get a banknote? Because you'd take your gold down to the bank, and you'd get a receipt for leaving your gold with them. That was a banknote. If it was a demand deposit, they'd give you a banknote, because you could give it to somebody else, and then he could get your gold in the bank. But then the banknote, governments started getting into the money game, and they started issuing banknotes, and they called them currency, okay? And now, there's not even that. Money's made out of credit. So this is a whole different thing to talk about, and this isn't the forum, because I got a lot of other things to talk about here. But I'm just trying to say there are distinctions here that have been lost and confused and conflated and misused. Now, getting away from the financial stuff, and I'm trying to get away from the financial stuff too. Because guys like Rick are on the ground every day. You got other guys, you got Adrian and Paul, and I don't know who else is here that's a financial guy. But, I kind of been there and done that, so I want to do that less. I don't want to stay a one-trick pony my whole life. So I'm getting out of the financial business. So let me get away from these financial terms here. People that use the word we, unless they're close friends of mine, I get very scary. And when they add the word should to the we, there is no we should, okay? Not unless we're really good buddies and we know how each other think. But all the time, you hear these talking heads and political people, we should, we should. No, if you want to, you should. I don't want to do it, okay? And people let them get away with this. It's incredible to me. This is a part of the politically correct syndrome. Politically correct. That word, that phrase, when I first heard that phrase, that's not politically correct, I thought it was a joke. I honestly thought, I think I might have even heard it in a joking context. I actually thought when people talked about politically correct or politically incorrect, I thought it was funny. And then it became real, and now it's, it's like yes, it's everywhere. They take this completely serious, and every day it gets worse and worse and worse. So part of this is diversity. We've got to have diversity, you know? No, we don't have to have diversity at all. If you want diversity, you can have it. If you don't want diversity, you don't have to have it. If you own a store and you don't want to let black people in, I think that's very stupid, but it's your store, okay? You don't have to have diversity in your store. You don't have diversity in your schools, and none of this. It's all complete nonsense. And this goes along, well, wait a minute. At the same time as we have diversity, we've got to have unity. I'm confused. I don't believe in unity, because in order to have unity, you have to address the lowest common denominator to get everybody to agree on something. That's how you get unity. And then you could all, you know, march off, or what do chimpanzees do? Anyway, it's like a bunch of chimpanzees. They're all united in the pack. But so we got to have diversity and unity both. And nobody ever explained that to me, how this happens. And then, you know, it used to be, it was okay to have privacy. But then they said, no, that's like secrecy, and secrecy is bad. I don't know why secrecy is bad, but these are other words. And now transparency. You know, you're not supposed to not have privacy or not have secrecy. You're supposed to actually have transparency. So it's not like a negative, having a negative. You got to have a positive, where you actually, far from keeping things private or, God forbid, secret, you've got to actually show things and be transparent. So this is another way that society is changing with the use of these words, that people use these words and they think that that's the way the world works. So I think transparency is another word that, you know, people just use because all the other chimpanzees are using it. I don't like transparency. Another one is fair. Let's be fair about this. You're not treating those workers fairly. I'd like you to be fair. That's not a fair deal. Fair? What in hell is fair? You know, fair is, you got one idea of fair, got another idea. We all got different ideas of fair as far as how to split this pie up that I guess we all own together, okay? I got a better idea. Why don't we just shit-can the word fair and use the word just? I like just better, because what does just mean? I don't know what fair means. I'm not sure anybody knows what fair means. But I know what just means. It means getting what you deserve. That's what just means. It's just if you get what you deserve. Now, we have to figure out what we all deserve. But, you know, we can do an exploration. It's usually just, you deserve it if you produced it, or if you bought it or traded for it, and so forth. So we can figure out what just is. We can't figure out what fair is. But I never see the word just used. I see the word fair used all the time. And I don't like it. There's so much of this. The language is so corrupted. In my opinion, the whole society is corrupted. But it often starts with language, because language is the father to what we think and what we believe. And what you think and what you believe is the father to what you do. So you corrupt the language, you're corrupting the whole society. That's why I'm talking about all these things, okay? Well, hate speech. This is recent too. Come on, 10 years ago? I don't know. You can check, see when hate speech became an actual thing. Look, I've always thought we had freedom of speech. You could say whatever you want. You just can't do whatever you want, okay? And I don't like things that are generally called hate speech, because generally they're in bad taste, quite frankly. They're unseemly, and polite people don't do hateful things. It shows you're badly brought up and so forth. But it's one thing to identify something as hate speech, which is sometimes just the identification of an actual fact, quite frankly. But then making laws against it. Wait a minute, what did Orwell say about this, you know? He had a lot of things. Love is hate, the ministry of truth, where everything's backwards. And I think hate speech is the next step in the direction of an Orwellian society, trying to figure out what stuff is and prosecuting people for saying it. Oh, here's a trivial thing that's always annoyed me. I know when this started. This started with CNN, which thankfully is going out of business. Remember, to amuse their idiotic viewers, they said, here's your factoid of the day, okay? Well, I don't want a factoid, because you know what a factoid is? People seem to think it's a little fact, like one sentence, you know, like, you know, a kilogram is 2.2 pounds. There's your factoid. It's not a factoid. What is a factoid? What is an android? An android is an artificial man. What is an asteroid? An asteroid is like it looks like a star, but it's not a star. So, well, what's a factoid? It looks like a fact, but it's not a fact, or it's an incorrect fact. But everybody uses this like factoid. Here's a factoid. I don't want a factoid. I want a fact. And if it's a little fact, call it a factet. But you know, this thing starts, and it's a sign of sloppy thinking. It really is. Well, that's a trivial example. I got a non-trivial example for you. You watch the news and you say, the U.S. decided to attack Afghanistan today, or France decided to, whatever. First of all, let's talk about the U.S. What is the U.S.? To me, it's the geographical area bounded by that line with Canada on the north and Mexico on the south. That's what the U.S. is. But people confuse that with the U.S. government, because every time you hear the U.S., almost every time, they're not talking about the U.S., which is an area with 320 million people. They're talking about the U.S. government, which is a certain group in and around the Beltway in Washington. So this is very confusing. It means that what they do in Washington means it's what we're doing. And so don't say that. Don't say, you know, the U.S. did this. No, they didn't. The U.S. government did this. And make that distinction, because then, I mean, I don't care if people hate the U.S. government, but I don't want them to hate U.S. residents. And, you know, they'll conflate that, because they'll think, well, we're responsible for it. But it's even worse than that, because they say, well, I'm an American, and America did this. And this is incredibly stupid, because what is America? I'll tell you what I think America is. America isn't even a geographical place like the U.S. is. America is an idea, and it was a very good idea, an excellent, a unique idea. But America doesn't even exist. So how can they talk about America? America's dead and buried. It's gone. I mean, we're farther away from America than we are from the Roman Empire. We're actually getting closer to the Roman Empire than we were to America. No, but they still use America. I mean, to me, America was California girls and hot dogs and apple pie and all that. But America is now about F-35s and B-2s and things like that. Anyway, America was a concept, so don't conflate that with the U.S. And then people go on to conflate the U.S. with the U.S. government. So we're like 3 standard deviations, not just 1, 3 standard deviations away from the truth, if you follow me. Now here's another one that's political. Healthcare. Everybody believes in healthcare, don't they? Everybody likes healthcare. It's a good idea. Yes, okay, I agree. Healthcare is a wonderful idea, but healthcare is something you provide for yourself. How do you do that? You do that through diet and exercise and, you know, good habits and staying away from bad habits, and that's how you provide health care to yourself, and seeing your doctor once in a while if you need to. How can the government give you health care? That is an individual thing. But people, the government, and people like them, love to use the idea of health care because everybody wants to be healthy. So we want health care. But you're not getting health, you're getting medical care. And medical care is different. It's like if you have your leg blown off. You don't need health care, you need medical care. Okay? You know, medical care is like things like that, okay? An auto accident or something. So something you pay a doctor for, okay? Health care is something that is organic, that you provide for yourself, basically. You're responsible for yourself. If I have health care, I'm responsible for myself. If the government has health care, they're responsible for me. So once again, you see the subtle difference here. This is running across all these words, okay? Medical care. Don't say health care. Next. We watch the news, okay? And we know that there's a civil war going on in the Ukraine, right? No, wrong. It's not a civil war, which is what they always say. It is a war of secession. A civil war was like the Spanish Civil War, where two groups were trying to capture the government in Madrid. Or like the Chinese Civil War, when Mao and Chiang Kai-shek were trying to capture the government of China. That's a civil war, okay? Where two groups are trying to capture the same government. So what's in the Ukraine? That is a war of secession. Those provinces in the eastern Ukraine, you can say, they're puppets of the Russians. Well, yeah, maybe they are. I mean, people always get in wars and get involved in civil wars and wars of secession and all that, and everybody's a puppet of somebody else, I guess. But the fact is that Donetsk and Lugansk are trying to secede from the rest of the Ukraine, which incidentally isn't even a real country. It's kind of a political intertidal zone where, you know, Romanians and Hungarians and Lithuanians and Poles and Russians all kind of gravitate around this, where there's some Ukrainians, but you know, the borders keep ebbing and flowing. So I think it's perfectly natural and good that these two provinces are trying to secede. In fact, I'd like to not only see that happen, but I'm all in back of the Basques and the Catalans seceding from Spain, and the Scots and the Welsh from the UK, and the same thing. In fact, we have about 225 countries in the world today. I'd like to see 2,225. I'd ultimately like to see about 7 billion little countries in the world today. So you should back these people in the eastern Ukraine. Sure, I mean, for all I know, they're Stalinists. I don't know, I don't care. It's a step in the right direction, okay? But it is not a civil war, and don't let anybody say that. Oh, incidentally, talking about civil wars, the unpleasantness in the United States from 1861 to 1865, that wasn't a civil war. That was a war of secession. So you should call it the war between the states, or you can call it the war of Southern secession, or you can call it the war of northern aggression, but don't call it the U.S. Civil War, and you should correct people. I mean, take opportunities to straighten these things out, you know. I mean, charity begins at home, okay? So you can do this too. Next. This is another one that's recent also. Weapons of mass destruction. What in hell are they? Well, they're supposed to be atomic or biological or chemical weapons. And I don't know how this meme got started, probably about 20 years ago. It used to be, those were called, in the military, that's what they were called. They were called ABC weapons, or NBC weapons sometimes. Very specific, atomic, biological, chemical. You know what you're dealing with. They're actually unconventional weapons. That's what they are, unconventional weapons used by the military. But they called them ABC. And then, I think this started with Saddam Hussein in the first Iraq War. That's about when it came in. Weapons of mass destruction. Because it sounds a lot more terrifying and deadly than ABC weapons, you know, really. But what are weapons of mass destruction? Well, atomic weapons definitely are. Biological? No. There's been no biological weapon developed that can do other than, I mean, yes, I guess you could say biological weapons were used against the American Indians historically. But that's not really, biological weapons have been uniquely unsuccessful. They're not weapons of mass destruction. Can cause damage. Chemical weapons, very hard to use them. They're not weapons of mass destruction. What's a weapon of mass destruction? It's a B-52 raid. It's an artillery barrage. That's mass destruction. So this is conflating things again to scare the chimpanzees, okay? ABC weapons doesn't scare you. They don't understand. Weapons of mass destruction, whatever that is, that scares them. Okay, another problem. Concentration camps, okay? You know, when I was in college, people used to say, the U.S. will never have concentration camps. We'll call them something else. And it was a joke. We all thought it was funny, and it turned out to be exactly what happened. We call them detention facilities. Detention facilities. So, you know, that's another good one. Sure, of course we have concentration camps. The thing at Guantanamo was a concentration camp. Well, yeah, but it has fighters in it. It has, wait a minute, they're not fighters. They're what kind of combatants are they?
Insurgents.
No. Enemy combatants, yes. I mean, we don't know if they're enemy combatants because very, very few of them were actually caught in combat. I mean, they're just called that. This is a new class of person to be an enemy combatant. And if you're accused of being an enemy combatant, then you can be put in a detention facility. So this is another thing to look out for. Well, actually it started after World War II. It used to be, up until 1946, when the U.S. Government was reorganized, actually. In fact, some people say it was actually a kind of a palace coup. It used to be, if the U.S. government wanted to go off and kill people in a foreign country, they had the War Department and the Navy Department. What's the difference? Well, the War Department used to be the thing that if you declared war, you'd go off and, you know, use the Army to do whatever they're going to do. And then you have the Navy Department, which was sailing around the world, and they had this little world, but then it was all put together in the Defense Department. Wait a minute. It's not the War Department, where we know what a war is, now it's the Defense Department. And oddly enough, since we've had the Defense Department in 1946, there has not been a war, a declared war. But there's been about 50 undeclared wars. But there really weren't when the Defense Department was there. Yeah, they did some things in Guatemala and Haiti and places like that. But I found this very interesting, that since we've had the Defense Department and the War Department went away, there actually are no wars, declared wars, but there's lots of wars. Very strange. I don't know what's going on. I think it has to do with the creation, or the development, not the creation, of the deep state. And this is kind of interesting. Some of you guys probably, I mean, I'm a personal friend of Ron Paul, and I like Ron. And even if Ron Paul had won the last time that he won, it wouldn't have done any good at all. Why? Because, I'll tell you, because of the existence of the deep state in the U.S. This is the interconnection of industry and science and government and the military and all of them, and they all have common interests, and they all slop at the the same trough, and they all think the same way. They share the same philosophy, and they all gravitate towards the government because they all, you know, it's like flies around dog dew. So it's perfectly predictable. And there actually is, I believe, something called the deep state. So if Ron Paul had actually been elected, I'll tell you what would have happened. Like the first, you know, week or month, he would have been in office when they saw this guy's might get a little bit out of control. All the directors of the Praetorian agencies, CIA, FBI, NSA, there's a score of them. All those guys with a whole bunch of generals would get together with them, and they tell him the way things are. And I think if he didn't get the idea, he might disappear, okay? Or maybe not. Maybe they just give him the word and see what happens next. And what would happen next is the Congress would impeach him, or the Supreme Court would say something that's everything's illegal. And if that didn't work, which it would, then all of your average Americans would get out into the streets because, as you know, they say that 47% of Americans receive more from the government than they pay into the government. Of course, I don't believe anybody should pay anything into the government, but 47% of people get more than they give to the government. So it's screwed up on both the getting and the giving side. And people think that's perfectly normal. You know, hey, you're not supposed to get benefits unless you pay taxes. Well, I suppose that's true, but I don't want to get anything or give anything. Anyway, 47% of the country right now. So Ron Paul, nothing would have happened. It would have been a disaster. Nothing would have changed. And the deep state, which is all these people in big industry and big medicine and the military and all these agencies and these 3 million government employees, they're all on the same team, okay? So forget about it. There are no political solutions. That's strictly to, you know, to make us think that we're free or whatever. What else? Wait a minute. You can't say these things if, and be a patriot. Patriot. I'm not even sure that that's a good thing. But in fact, most people, patriotism's good, right? Everybody says patriotism's good. Well, I don't know. I'm not sure. What am I patriotic of? I mean, patriotic for my city? What if my city broke off from the U.S.? Would I be patriotic and not patriotic for my state? My state broke off? Or the U.S.? What are you supposed to be patriotic to? What is your, you know, how the hell are people patriotic to Canada, for God's sake? I mean, it's an agglomeration. I mean, Canada really should break up, just like the U.S. should break up. I mean, I don't know, the U.S. from a cultural point of view, I mean, assuming you wanted to even have these stupid political entities, it should probably be at least 6 different things. And Canada should be, I'd say BC, and then you probably have those prairie provinces, Quebec, oh yeah, for sure, Ontario, and then the Maritimes. So Canada ought to be, culturally speaking, at least 5 different places anyway. So I don't know what this patriotism's about. I really don't. But actually, you know, that's kind of warm and fuzzy to be a patriot, you know. It means that you're only a chimpanzee that starts hooting and panting in wartime or when we are under threat somehow. I don't feel under threat. But most of these people are actually nationalists, okay? And a nationalist is wants to line up in back of our leaders and the government. But actually, you shouldn't even call them nationalists. They're really jingoists. I mean, really, they're just emotional, semi-psychopathic people that take this whole illusion seriously. So let's throw, instead of trying to make distinctions between nationalism, patriotism, and jingoism, let's just throw all 3 of those words in the shit can. But wait a minute, if I'm not going to be one of those things, then I must be an isolationist, okay? Anybody that doesn't want to, send the troops over there before the guys that are living in caves
send their high-tech army over here, and I'm an isolationist. Actually, I'm just a non-interventionist, you know. I don't believe in breaking up fights between people that I don't even know who's right and who's wrong. And who, like this thing with ISIS, or ISIL, whichever it is. I mean, it's, you know, after they take over a certain amount of land, you know, what's going to happen to them is the same thing that happens to every organization. It'll become stultified and concrete bound and bureaucratized, and it'll be just like another one of those nothing nowhere states in the Middle East that you can't even find them on a map. So forget about it, okay? Forget about it. It's certainly not anything to, you know, send in the Marines or whoever they're going to do for that. And none of these countries, you all know this, not one country in Africa is a real country, kind of. Like, you could say France is kind of a real country, although even then you can make arguments that France is artificial. But none of those countries in Africa or the Middle East or Central Asia, none of them are real countries. They're all just artificial lines on a map where then the government decides to defend the lines on a map that some guys in Europe drew 100 years ago. Then we got hot buttons. It's discrimination and racism. You're not supposed to discriminate against other people. You know what? If I'm walking down the street and there's, you know, 3 or 4, you know, white guys wearing ties, and I'm not too worried that anybody's, but if I'm walking down the street and there's a half a dozen young black guys with boom boxes, I'm worried. So I'm discriminating, okay? So we don't need to go into all this. It's actually quite rational to discriminate. But you have to be intelligent about these things. And you don't make laws about these things. So enough said about that. Well, and the people that, you know, people say, our heroes in uniform, our heroes in the police force and the army and whatever. Well, I don't know if they're heroes. I mean, some are, I guess. What's a hero? I don't know. A hero is generally defined as somebody who does something that takes a great amount of courage with a large amount of personal risk involved. That's what a hero is. And I don't know, most of the cops and the soldiers, they're just government employees, frankly. And they're not heroes because they want to be heroes. If they get into a nasty situation, maybe they're going to be heroes because they owe the guy next to them something. They don't care about patriotism or anything like that. They just want to stay alive. And to stay alive, maybe you've got to do something that's courageous. So calling all these people in uniform heroes is ridiculous and disgusting, and they should be caught up on it. And the word hero has become totally degraded, like the whole society has become degraded at this point. It's embarrassing. And anyway, cops are not peace officers. Nobody uses that term anymore, okay? They don't keep the peace. They enforce the laws. That's a totally different thing. And most of these laws are not worth enforcing. You know how I feel about laws. I mean, people say, well, the only laws we need are the 10 Commandments. And I say, really? I mean, first of all, I can't even remember them. And the Catholics and the Protestants and the Jews all have different versions of the 10 Commandments. And the 10 Commandments are pretty stupid, frankly, because the first 3 are about how you should worship no other gods and so forth. You know, so 3 of them are irrelevant, you know, if you're a thinking person, I think. And so, no, that's too many. And people say, well, okay, all right. It's rational to say that actually there should be just 2 laws, okay? Do all that you say you're going to do, and don't aggress against other people or their property. You know what? Ignorance of the law is no excuse. If you only got 2 laws and they're simple and commonsensical like those 2 laws. Do all that you say you're going to do and don't aggress against other people and their property. Okay, everybody knows those laws, and ignorance
of the law is no excuse. When there's only ignorance of the law is an excuse when it's a library that'll fill this room with trivia. But you know what? Just as scientists for many years have been trying to boil down the universe into just one great law. You know, you've got the, trying to remember the three. You got the law of gravity, you got the law of electromagnetism, you got the strong force, the weak force. They're trying to boil that into one great law somehow. Okay, I've done it from a moral point of view. You don't even need those two laws that I just mentioned. You want to know it? There's only one law. Let me give it to you. The whole of the law shall be do as thou wilt, but be prepared to accept the consequences. As long as you remember that second phrase, you're okay, because then, before you do anything, you've got to figure out what the consequences are, which helps people to think, which just obeying some idiot law that's made by a legislature doesn't help people to think. It helps them to act like robots instead. So, whole of the law is do as thou wilt. Anything. Anything you want, go ahead. But be prepared to accept the consequences. Now, what are the consequences of that? And it gets very interesting. And generally speaking, if people think things out that way, they'll do the right thing. And then, if they do the wrong thing, they'll get what they deserve. Hopefully justice, not fair treatment, whatever that is. I mean, this all ties together, I think. So, but forget about that. If you try to explain any of this to the cop that's busting you, you know, I mean, he's, you know, all he does is enforce the laws. He's just a paid employee of the state. He's not a hero. And he's not wearing a uniform. That's another thing. You know, be proud to wear your country's uniform. Well, what's the difference between a uniform and a costume? You know? And most of these guys are clowns, let's admit it. I have to be so careful about saying this kind of stuff, though, because yesterday, this was just yesterday, this happens a lot to me. Just yesterday, after Marin Katusa gave his workshop, and he invited Paul Van Eden and I to, you know, kind of be up there with them and do point-counterpoint. And so we were strictly talking about mining, the whole half hour, nothing but mining, nothing. And so after it, some guy comes up to me, and he says, what did he say? I said, his opening thing was, he said, were you in the service? And I explained, no, I wasn't in the service. And he says, well, I don't like your views on the military. You know, what did I say? I didn't say anything about that. I mean, I pushed this guy's button, or he thought I pushed his button, or he read something that pushed his button. He had, you know, he had some kind of an engram where he hears this, therefore he's got to react this way. You know, he's a hostile guy. But I get this quite a bit. I mean, it amuses me. It doesn't bother me. But I just point that out because, you know, when you say things that are at odds with what most people believe, or what most people think they believe, or actually what most people think they're supposed to believe, because they don't know, you know, it pushes people's buttons. And it's a stimulus response reaction as opposed to a thought out thing. And then they want to argue. They don't want to discuss or explore. They want to argue. And I don't like arguing. It's a boring waste of time. Anyway, I don't know if I'm over time. We got time for a question or a reaction? Reaction? Like that? Yeah, like that guy that yesterday.
Just ask you quickly. You talked about capitalism and morality and out in the rest of the world. Well, maybe that's an oxymoron. And I think part of the problem is that we cannot have a clear definition of capitalism or morality for that.
Very good. Very good. That's a softball. And I think, I must have skipped over that on my list. Capitalism. Well, that was a term that was coined by, of all people, Karl Marx. I mean, that's a little known fact. Factet, yes. So, capitalism, I think it's the natural order of things, quite frankly. It's not a system, it's actually the free market. I mean, capitalism it's a problem. I think it's a problematical concept and a problematical word because in point of fact, and I'm dodging defining it exactly right now, but let me instead define two other things that are often confused with it. And the most important of them is fascism. Everybody thinks fascism's got something to do with black uniforms and jackboots and racism and that whole shtick. Actually, it's got nothing to do with that. Fascism is an economic system. And to take a Marxist breakdown of this, Marx would have said, capitalism, a system, and I'm trying to define it now, a system where both private, personal property, cars, clothes, toothbrushes, stuff like that. It doesn't produce stuff necessarily. That's privately owned. And also the means of production, mines, fields, factories, etc., they're also privately owned. And both are privately controlled. Privately owned, privately controlled, consumer goods and means of production, capitalism. Usually, almost always confused with fascism. What's fascism? Fascism is where private goods are privately owned. Own your car, your house, your toothbrush, in Nazi Germany or all kinds of, well, every other country in the world, because you're almost all fascist today. But the means of production are privately owned. I mean, General Motors, kind of, but certainly Apple and Google and all that are all owned by the shareholders. But, much more important, they're controlled by the state. It's all controlled by the state. And you get to trade your stock certificates and, you buy and sell and you can start stuff and all that. And the state likes that. The state has discarded communism. I should have started from the other end. It would be more logical. Because they've seen what happens when there's too much state. It's better when you have something resembling a free market. That's fascism. Fascism is technically where everything's privately owned, but state-controlled. And that's the difference between fascism and capitalism. The whole world today is fascist. How about socialism? Socialism is where the means of production are owned by the state, but private goods are privately owned, although controlled by the state. So, do we have any socialist states in the world today? China is still a little bit kind of semi-socialist. They own their state-owned industries. I think we got a few state-owned industries here in North America. A little bit of socialism. So it's not pure fascism everywhere. Melange of socialism. I don't know if we have any even pure socialist states in the world today where all the means of production are owned by the state. I don't think so. And then you've got communism, where everything is owned by the state and controlled by the state. And there are no communists. It doesn't exist. Okay, China tried. North Korea tried. So anyway, these are accurate economic distinctions. And people misuse these words all the time.
Here's the next question.
Oh.
I just wanted to get your thoughts on the topic of interventionism. So I'm on board with not having states intervene overseas. But in the past, we used to have a more open mind about allowing individuals to pick sides in international conflicts and go over and support people, such as in the Spanish Civil War.
Sure.
So right now, with the states putting a lot of effort into preventing ISIS from recruiting over here, and you know, if the radical Islam people want to go over and fight it out and get themselves killed, I'm fine with that.
Yeah, sure.
If people want to go over and support the Ukraine on either side, I'm fine with that.
Absolutely. I am totally too. I mean, sure. I mean, really, you ought to support anybody you want and give money to whoever you want, and I think it's great. I mean, sure. I'm all for mercenaries as individuals and mercenary armies, and I think it's great. I mean, you know, I mean, not great. I mean, I don't like to see fighting because people get hurt and it's destructive. But, you know, do as thou wilt. Yeah, totally. But it's illegal now. You know, at least for an American citizen to, you know, join a foreign army or something like that, you can be prosecuted. Not just for ISIS.
You made a distinction between healthcare and medical care.
Yes.
I felt compelled to make a further distinction between medical care, which is reactive, and proactive health maintenance. You know, it was really disturbing. I found it really disturbing, the whole quote-unquote discussion about Obamacare and the supposed, you know, reactive plan. It's as though they have roads full of nails and their plan is to patch up the tires on a mile-by-mile basis. That's the entirety of the discussion. What we really need is health maintenance. So that's the only way to get out of the quagmire that we're in, financial quagmire that we're in. It's disturbing the discussion.
No, you're absolutely right. And actually, if we lived in a free market world, which we don't, the price of medical care would have been collapsing the way the price of computers has been collapsing, simply because it is also a high-tech thing. Medical care is very high-tech these days, and its price should be collapsing the way computers have, but we're going the opposite direction, just like the price of education, well, not education, that's incorrect, schooling, I guess, especially on the university level, has been going up too. So wherever the state sticks its tawdry, dirty fingers, everything is destroyed. So I'm kind of looking forward to the collapse of what's left of Western civilization. But on the other hand, as I always say, you know, if I'd been in France in 1789, I would have cheered, you know, the storming the Bastille and bringing down of Louis XVI, except it got worse, because then they got Robespierre, and then they got Napoleon, and Nicholas II in Russia. I would have cheered that. Except then they got Lenin, and then they got Stalin. So, you know, after the regime in Washington falls, there's no predicting what's going to happen. I doubt if it's going to be anartopia or anything like that.
Last question.
Okay.
I'm an anarchist, but if I were king, there would be one law, and that would be every speaker is required to define the main terms they're going to be talking about before they start speaking.
Oh,
it's very rare.
I'm sorry.
A very rare speaker does that, so
thank you.
It's a breath of fresh air.
Thank you very much.
And I had two terms that I thought you might comment on. One is nonprofit. In San Francisco, if you ask someone what they do, about 70% of them will say, I work for a nonprofit. That tells me nothing about what they do. Maybe I'm missing something.
No, you're not.
They think they told me. And then the other one is recycling. If you believe in the second law of thermodynamics, everything is being recycled.
Yeah.
So in the recycling box, I just throw everything.
Thank you. Those are great comments. And I've got to say, the second law of thermodynamics is one of the very few laws I really believe in. And recycling, bicycling, it all comes out of San Francisco. And the other thing, nonprofits, you know, they really are a scam because, you know, people say, oh, nonprofit. I mean, we just got a bunch of flower children that are, you know, working as interns for free and all that. But what actually happens is that you put the money into the nonprofit, they produce absolutely nothing. And, you know, they employ people. They're not work. People don't work for nonprofits. They're employed by nonprofits. It's a very passive type of thing. And, you know, a lot of money comes into it, and a lot of money is paid out to the top executives in gigantic salaries, and also in bennies and lavish parties and all that. So they're really much more egregious than even the worst corporations are. So it's a giant scam, like so much in the world. But excellent comment. Thank you very much.
Okay,